Let me take this deeper, because there is a major difference between going no contact and actually changing the emotional dynamic. Most people think the strongest response to an avoidant is to disappear completely. They imagine that silence itself is the weapon, but silence is only powerful when it comes from self-respect. If you go silent while secretly staring at your phone, waiting for a message, wondering whether they miss you, calculating how many days it has been, then physically you may be distant, but psychologically you are still chasing. Your body has left the relationship, but your mind is still living inside it. And that is the distinction I want you to understand. The real transformation begins when you stop chasing the person and, more importantly, stop chasing the outcome. You stop asking, what can I do to make them come closer? And start asking, what kind of person am I becoming through this experience? That question changes everything. Because when someone repeatedly pulls away, human nature often tells us to increase our effort. We explain more, we communicate more, we become more patient. We send another message because perhaps the previous one was misunderstood. We offer reassurance because maybe they are afraid. We give them another opportunity because perhaps this time they will recognize our value. But there is a psychological trap hidden inside that behavior. The more you pursue someone who is withdrawing, the more you can accidentally teach yourself that their distance must be overcome by your effort. You begin making their emotional availability the measure of your own security. Their response determines your mood. Their silence determines your confidence. Their attention determines whether you feel chosen. And now you are no longer simply loving someone. You are negotiating with uncertainty. That is exhausting. The healthier move is not to punish them for withdrawing. It is to stop participating in a pattern that requires you to abandon yourself in order to maintain connection. Think about what happens when you genuinely step back. You don't announce it dramatically. You don't post cryptic messages. You don't try to make them jealous. You don't send one final paragraph explaining everything they did wrong. You simply stop forcing what cannot be forced. You allow space to exist. But there is an important distinction. You are not creating space as a manipulation tactic. You are accepting reality. If someone wants distance, you give them distance. If someone cannot communicate consistently, you stop filling every silence with your own effort. If someone is uncertain about what they want, you stop trying to make the decision for them. And suddenly, something remarkable happens. The emotional responsibility returns to where it belongs. They have to experience their own choices. You see, when you are constantly chasing someone, you can unintentionally protect them from the consequences of their own behavior. They withdraw, and you come running. They become distant, and you provide reassurance. They stop communicating, and you initiate again. They create uncertainty, and you work harder to create certainty. That means they never have to fully experience what their withdrawal creates. But when you calmly step back, you remove yourself from that equation. Now there is no emotional rescue mission. There is simply reality. And reality has a way of revealing things that chasing never can. Maybe they genuinely need space. Maybe they are emotionally overwhelmed. Maybe they are uncertain. Maybe they simply do not want the relationship. You cannot control which explanation is true. What you can control is whether you continue sacrificing your peace, trying to discover an answer they are unwilling or unable to give you. This is where emotional strength begins. Emotional strength is not becoming cold. It is becoming clear. It is being able to say, I care about you, but I will not chase you. It is being able to say, I value this connection, but I will not prove my worth by tolerating endless uncertainty. It is being able to say, I am open to genuine connection, but I am no longer available for a relationship where I have to constantly convince someone to participate. That is a completely different psychological position. And notice what happens internally when you make that shift. You begin getting your attention back. You start investing in your work again. Your friendships become meaningful again. Your ambitions become visible again. You stop checking whether they viewed something. You stop interpreting every online activity as a hidden message. You stop building entire emotional theories around a 3-word response. Your nervous system begins learning something profoundly important. I can survive uncertainty without abandoning myself. That is a form of freedom. And if the other person notices that change, let them notice it. But don't make their reaction the purpose of your transformation. Because the moment your personal growth becomes a strategy designed to make them come back, you are still emotionally dependent on their response. The goal is not to become distant so they chase you. The goal is to become grounded enough that you no longer need to chase anyone. There is a philosophical principle here that applies far beyond relationships. What you repeatedly pursue can eventually become what controls you. If you spend your entire life pursuing validation, validation controls you. If you pursue someone's attention, their attention controls you. If you pursue certainty from someone who cannot provide it, their uncertainty controls you. But when you reclaim your attention, you reclaim your power. And this does not mean you stop loving. In fact, it can create a more mature form of love. You can care without controlling. You can miss someone without contacting them impulsively. You can hope for reconciliation without putting your life on pause. You can remain compassionate without becoming self-sacrificing. That is the balance. You don't have to harden your heart. You have to strengthen your boundaries. And there is something deeply attractive about a person who can do that. Not because it triggers someone else, but because it demonstrates inner stability. You are communicating through your behavior that connection is something you participate in, not something you beg to maintain. So if someone pulls away, don't immediately ask, how do I get them back? Ask a better question. What happens if I stop abandoning myself to keep them close? That question can change your entire life. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is not reaching harder. Sometimes it is releasing your grip, standing firmly in your own life, and allowing another person to decide whether they are capable of meeting you there. Stop chasing their presence. Start protecting your peace. The moment you stop abandoning yourself, the entire relationship dynamic changes. Now let's go one level deeper, because once you stop chasing, something else has to happen. You have to stop trying to preserve the old version of yourself that existed inside that relationship. This is where most people misunderstand what emotional distance really means. They think, if I stop contacting them, they will realize what they lost. But that still places your attention on them. You are still measuring your behavior according to the reaction you hope to produce. The deeper transformation is different. You don't simply become less available. You become different. And when you become different, the entire emotional equation changes. Think about the version of you they became accustomed to. Perhaps you were always available. Perhaps you responded immediately. Perhaps you tolerated inconsistencies because you believed patience would eventually create security. Perhaps you kept explaining your feelings because you thought that if you could just communicate clearly enough, that they would finally understand what you needed. Maybe you became the person who repaired every uncomfortable moment. They pulled away and you reached out. They became distant and you reassured them. They stopped communicating and you opened the conversation again. They created uncertainty and you supplied certainty. Over time, that can create an invisible pattern where one person withdraws and the other compensates. And once that pattern becomes predictable, neither person has to consciously choose it anymore. It simply happens. But imagine what happens when you stop playing your assigned role. Not dramatically, not vindictively, not because you want to make them jealous. You simply decide that the old version of you is no longer available. That is powerful because human beings respond not only to someone's physical absence, but to changes in patterns. When a familiar emotional pattern disappears, the mind has to reassess what it previously took for granted. The person who was always there is no longer always there. The person who accepted every inconsistency now has standards. The person who used to explain everything now communicates clearly once and allows their actions to speak. The person who was constantly trying to maintain connection is now building a life that does not depend on someone else's participation. And that can create a very different kind of realization. Because suddenly, the question is no longer, why aren't they chasing me? The question becomes, what changed? And that question can be uncomfortable because it forces a person to confront something that constant access can hide, the value of what they had. There is a psychological principle here that applies to almost every area of life. When something is endlessly available, the mind can become habituated to it. Familiarity can make extraordinary things feel ordinary. Someone can become accustomed to your kindness, accustomed to your patience, accustomed to your attention, accustomed to your forgiveness, accustomed to knowing that no matter how far they retreat, you will eventually close the distance. But when that pattern changes, they may finally have an opportunity to see the relationship without the constant reassurance you were providing. And this is why your transformation matters more than your disappearance. No contact says, I'm not talking to you. Transformation says I'm no longer living the same way. Those are not the same message. One is about communication. The other is about identity. And identity is where lasting change happens. You have to understand that boundaries are not punishments. A boundary is not, I'm going to withdraw so that you suffer. A boundary is, this is what I will and will not participate in. That distinction matters enormously. If you establish a boundary because you want someone to panic, you are still emotionally dependent on their reaction. But if you establish a boundary because you have decided that your peace, dignity, and emotional stability matter, then the boundary becomes an expression of self-respect. You are no longer asking, will this make them come back? You are asking, does this allow me to remain true to myself? That is maturity. And there is something else that happens when you stop being endlessly available. You create the possibility for genuine choice. If you are constantly pursuing someone, they can remain passive. They don't have to decide. They simply react to your effort. But when you step back, they have to decide what they actually want. Do they want to reconnect? Do they want to communicate? Do they want to repair? Do they want to let the relationship go? You cannot make that decision for them, and you shouldn't, because love without freedom is not really love. It becomes management. You are trying to manage another person's emotions, decisions, fears, and behavior so that you can feel secure. But nobody can build a healthy relationship that way. A relationship becomes meaningful when two people freely choose to participate. So your job is not to engineer their realization. Your job is to become so honest with yourself that you no longer need to manipulate circumstances to obtain the relationship you want. This also means that your growth cannot be theatrical. Don't suddenly become someone you're not because you think they are watching. Don't post your happiness. Don't manufacture jealousy. Don't try to demonstrate how much better you're doing. Real transformation doesn't need an audience. You simply begin living differently. You sleep better. You work harder. You become more disciplined. You reconnect with people you neglected. You pursue goals that existed before the relationship consumed your attention. You learn to tolerate silence without turning it into an emergency. And slowly, you become less emotionally reactive. That is when the deepest shift occurs. Because you are no longer waiting for another person to restore your sense of worth. You have restored it yourself. And if that person eventually recognizes the change, that recognition is secondary. It is not the objective. The objective is that you have become someone who can no longer be controlled by inconsistent attention. That is freedom. And here's the paradox. Sometimes the moment you stop trying to prove that you are valuable is the moment another person finally has the space to recognize your value. But even then, you must remain grounded. Because someone returning is not automatically evidence of transformation. Words are not transformation. Temporary attention is not transformation. A sudden burst of affection is not transformation. Real transformation is consistency. It is communication. It is accountability. It is willingness to meet each other emotionally rather than repeatedly recreating the same cycle. So don't confuse someone's renewed interest with a changed relationship. If they come back, let their behavior answer the question. And if they don't come back, let your growth answer an even more important question. Did I become more fully myself? Because ultimately, that is the victory. You are not trying to win a person. You are trying to stop losing yourself. And once you understand that, you no longer need psychological games, calculated silence, or emotional manipulation. You simply live from a position of self-respect. You become less available to chaos and more available to peace. Less interested in proving and more interested in living. Less focused on whether they choose you and more committed to choosing yourself. That is the kind of change that cannot be faked. And when you become unavailable to the old dynamic, you create something far more powerful than no contact. You create a new reality in which access to you requires mutual effort, emotional responsibility, and genuine connection. Don't disappear to make someone miss you. Evolve so deeply that you no longer need to be chased to know your worth. And now we arrive at the deepest part of this entire transformation. Because stopping the chase is powerful. Changing the pattern is powerful. But there's one final shift that determines whether you have actually reclaimed your power or whether you are simply waiting for the other person to validate your progress. You have to become so secure in yourself that their return is no longer the prize. Think about how difficult that sounds when you are emotionally attached to someone. When you care deeply, you naturally want the relationship to work. You want the message. You want the apology. You want the conversation. You want them to finally say, I understand now. I realize what I lost. And there is nothing wrong with wanting love. There is nothing wrong with hoping for reconciliation. The problem begins when their return becomes the condition for your peace. Because the moment you decide, consciously or unconsciously, that you will finally feel worthy when they come back, you have handed them authority over your emotional life. They now possess a key they were never supposed to have. Their attention determines your mood. Their silence determines your confidence. Their affection determines your sense of security. Their decision determines whether you believe you are enough. And that is not love. That is emotional dependency disguised as love. Real emotional strength begins when you can say, I would love for this person to be part of my life, but I will still have a life if they choose not to be. That sentence represents an enormous psychological shift, because now you are not choosing between loving them and loving yourself. You are doing both. You can care without clinging. You can miss someone without abandoning yourself. You can remain open without waiting. You can forgive without accepting the same behavior again. And you can hope without putting your entire future on hold. This is what emotional freedom looks like. And ironically, this is often the point where the entire dynamic becomes different. Because when you no longer need someone to choose you, you become capable of evaluating whether you actually choose them. That's a profound difference. Before, your question may have been, how do I make this person want me? Now the question becomes, is this person capable of giving me the kind of relationship I want? One question places them at the center. The other places your values at the center, and your values are where your life should be organized. Ask yourself, what kind of relationship do I want? What kind of communication do I require? What does emotional consistency mean to me? What behaviors am I no longer willing to normalize? What does mutual respect actually look like? These questions move you out of emotional reaction and into conscious choice. Because attraction alone is not enough. Chemistry is not enough. History is not enough. Missing someone is not enough. Even loving someone is not always enough to create a healthy relationship. A relationship requires two people who are willing and capable of participating in it. And that is where you need discernment. If someone returns, don't immediately celebrate the return as proof that everything has changed. Watch, listen, observe. Do their actions match their words? Are they communicating more honestly? Are they willing to discuss difficult subjects? Are they taking responsibility for their behavior? Are they capable of consistency? Are they respecting your boundaries? Are they making room for your needs instead of expecting you to shrink yours? These questions matter because emotional intensity can create the illusion of transformation. Someone can miss you tremendously and still be unable to build a healthy relationship with you. Someone can fear losing you and still not know how to love you consistently. Someone can return because they feel lonely, nostalgic, guilty, or uncertain. That is why your power cannot come from their return. Your power must come from your ability to evaluate reality. And there is a beautiful philosophical principle here. Freedom is not getting everything you want. Freedom is no longer being destroyed by what you cannot control. You cannot control whether another person chooses you. You cannot control when they gain clarity. You cannot control whether they overcome their fears. You cannot control whether they return. But you can control what you do with your life while they are figuring themselves out. That is where your power lives. So instead of spending weeks asking, do they miss me? Ask, am I becoming someone I respect? Instead of asking, will they come back? Ask, am I building a life I would be proud to live even if they never do? Instead of asking, how can I make them realize my value? Ask, why am I still waiting for someone else to confirm it? That last question can be uncomfortable, but discomfort is often the beginning of clarity, because perhaps the greatest wound was never simply that they walked away. Perhaps the deeper wound was that you started walking away from yourself while trying to keep them. You ignored your instincts. You accepted less than you wanted. You over-explained. You overgave. You waited. You rationalized. You kept hoping that one more conversation would finally produce the security you needed. And eventually, you became more committed to maintaining the connection than maintaining your own identity. That is what has to end. Not necessarily your love, not necessarily your hope, but your willingness to betray yourself for connection. Because when you stop doing that, something extraordinary happens. You become calm. Not because you know what they will do, but because you know what you will do. And that is the ultimate form of security. You don't need certainty about another person's behavior when you have certainty about your own standards. If they communicate honestly, you can respond. If they approach you with genuine accountability, you can evaluate it. If they remain distant, you can continue living. If they return, you don't collapse into fantasy. If they leave, you don't collapse into despair. You remain yourself. That is emotional sovereignty. And emotional sovereignty is not coldness. It is the ability to remain connected to your heart without surrendering control of your life. This is especially important because sometimes people become obsessed with the idea that an avoidant must eventually break, chase, regret, or return. But be careful. Your healing should never depend on someone else's breakdown. You don't need another person to suffer for your healing to be legitimate. You don't need them to regret losing you for your relationship to have mattered. You don't need them to return for your growth to count. You don't need an apology to decide that you deserve peace. That is the point where you become genuinely powerful, because now your life is no longer a waiting room. You are moving, you are building, you are learning, you are becoming. And if someone eventually wants to walk beside you, they must meet the person you have become, not the version of you who was willing to accept anything just to keep them close. That is the real meaning of choosing yourself. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop bargaining with your dignity. It means you stop treating someone's inconsistency as a challenge you have to solve. It means you stop confusing pursuit with love. And once you understand that, the question changes forever. You no longer ask, how do I make them stay? You ask, can we build something where neither of us has to run? That is a much higher standard, and that is the standard you should carry forward. Because the ultimate victory isn't getting someone back. The ultimate victory is becoming so grounded in who you are that whether they return or not, you remain whole. Never make someone else's return the proof that you are worthy. Choose yourself so completely that love becomes a choice, not a desperate need.